Washington, last May, Representative Pramila Jayapal introduced the Paycheck Recovery Act, aimed at curbing layoffs during the pandemic by having the federal government pay people's salaries. Publicly, Jayapal contended that passing the bill was a matter of survival for workers. But privately, former staffers said the lawmaker acted very differently. In November 2020, she laid off 2 staffers without severance. 2 people familiar with the incident told BuzzFeed News. Chris Evans, a spokesperson for Jayapal, said the decision to consolidate was made to best utilize the office's resources, and the staffers were given 6 weeks' notice. But one staff member who was told they were being laid off was invited to reapply for a new job in the office that would consolidate the 2 roles, those familiar said. The staffer was required to go through the full application process, despite the job being nearly identical to the one they had been laid off from. And then, without advance warning, they found out in an all-hands meeting that they did not get the job. The staffers who were let go declined to provide comment for this story.
The incident upset at least 4 staffers in the office who spoke with BuzzFeed News. It was, they said, one of many instances in which Jayapal's interactions with her employees have run counter to the public persona she's built for herself. Despite the fact that Jayapal is one of the highest-profile progressives in DC and the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, 14 former staffers from throughout her nearly 5 years in Congress describe a dysfunctional and volatile workplace. There is, they said, a serious disconnect between how she talks about workers' rights and how she treats her own staff. The conversations with former staff members, all granted anonymity to speak candidly due to the insular nature of Capitol Hill and fears of retaliation, reveal an especially harsh office with a boss whose treatment of workers runs contrary to the public expectations she has set for others. In interviews with BuzzFeed News, they described Jayapal as a boss who berated staff in front of others, demanded grueling hours, and maintained an office culture marked by constantly changing expectations and little tolerance for error, to the extent that some staff had sought therapy and questioned their careers in public service. Since taking office, Jayapal has had one of the highest staff turnover rates in the House, due in large part, former employees said, to the unrealistic standards she sets. "It's not sustainable to be able to stay for too long," one said. The staffers' stories are also reflective of major cultural shifts and a broader recognition of inequities happening in both DC and across the country. It is undeniable that women in politics, especially women of color, are held to a different standard than white men, and Jayapal is no exception. But as someone who rose to national prominence with an agenda centered on the dignity of working people, she now faces a changing workforce herself. On Capitol Hill, where elected officials have wide sway over how they operate their offices, generations have been subjected to a range of behaviors, from unquestionably positive to abusive. Many members of Washington's professional class feel that the tough conditions and low pay are a rite of passage, the trade-off being that they get to work in one of the most powerful institutions in the world. But the workforce now is less willing to accept undignified working conditions as a necessary evil on the path to fulfilling ever higher career ambitions. If you have more information or a tip about what it's like working on Capitol Hill, contact these reporters at adi.baird@buzzfeed.com or lisandra.villahuetan@buzzfeed.com, or see other ways to send tips here. In response to requests to comment for this story, Jayapal's chief of staff, Lila Pomeranz, said in a statement, "Women of color often unjustly targeted, regularly held to higher standards than their male colleagues, and always put under a sexist microscope." Pomeranz claimed that the anecdotes were cherry-picked, contained ugly stereotypes, and lacked context. BuzzFeed News spent more than 3 months reporting, confirmed accounts with multiple sources, reviewed documents and text messages, and reached out to staffers from throughout Jayapal's tenure. "I've worked in bad environments before, and I have worked in some awful environments before for some awful people. I've been colleagues with some awful people," one former Jayapal staffer said. "I have never worked in a place that has made me so miserable and so not excited for public service as Pramila Jayapal's office." Many felt obligated to speak out despite worrying that a critical story about Jayapal would reflect poorly on the progressive movement they believe in. "It's almost like Stockholm Syndrome," one former staffer said. Ultimately, most decided to share their accounts because they felt it was vital to spotlight how the progressive leader treats her staff in the Capitol Hill culture that enables that behaviour. Pramila has the absurd task of tackling some of the country's most urgent problems with the limited resources our system provides. Like all members of Congress, she must decide how much of that burden to place on her staff. And like all members of Congress, she doesn't always get it right, said another former staffer, who noted that, while they were treated respectfully while they worked in her office, they couldn't speak for others. I believe she is doing the best she can, and hope that any talk around working conditions can help inspire progressive members to raise the standard above the status quo. Jayapal is an effective public advocate for workers, another former staffer said. She just doesn't recognise that the staff are also humans.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe